All right, next I want to turn to curriculum in particular and just mention three distinctive attributes of a pragmatic curriculum and contrast them especially to idealism and realism again. One thing that the pragmatists are very insistent upon is that the curriculum should not be the traditional piecemeal, siloed curriculum that most of us are familiar with. The pragmatists were among the first to emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of most of the curricular elements, and so to take what had been discrete subjects and start to put them in larger modules and curricular groupings with new labels and so forth. So rather than, for example, teaching history and geography and civics and economics as distinct subject matters, the pragmatists were the first to say we need to put these all into the social sciences, and what we will do is we'll teach social studies, and social studies will be an integrated unit of all of those elements connected. Rather than teaching the sciences in parceled out fashion where we have physics over here and then chemistry and then biology and then mathematics as a separate subject, instead we will just have a science studies unit in which we study all of them in a relatively integrated fashion. And then the same thing holds for the arts and the humanities. So interdisciplinary studies, emphasizing the connectedness and the holistic nature of all of knowledge rather than discrete, particularized, atomized, or individualized approaches to the curriculum. Second curricular element I want to focus on is history. History has a special place in the pragmatic curriculum, and the rationale for including history and how history is taught under pragmatism is very different from that of idealism and realism. Just backtrack a little bit to pragmatism's philosophical themes. If we think of the metaphysics of pragmatism, pragmatism emphasizes evolution as a fundamental, not simply biological truth, but metaphysical truth. All of the universe is in process. If we do just focus on the biology for a moment, we know that back a long time ago, the kinds of creatures that existed and flourished on the earth are very different than the kinds of creatures that exist on the earth now. And as evolution progresses, the kind of creatures that exist and flourish on the earth in millions of years from now are again likely to be very different. If we blow that up to cosmic proportions, everything over the course of history is changing, including all of human history. Now this has an implication for the study of history. If we think that the past is dramatically different from the present, and that the present is dramatically different than what the future is going to be, then what is the point of studying old things or ancient history, particularly if, as pragmatists, we're interested in practicality, the real world, functionality and workability in the here and now? To the extent that as pragmatists we emphasize process and change, we're more likely then to believe that the way things are now are very different than the way things were in the past, and so things in the distant past have very little relevance to our being able to deal with contemporary issues. So for metaphysical reasons, pragmatists are more likely then to de-emphasize ancient history, right, or classical history, and the kinds of history that they will be interested in are going to be relatively recent historical events, because the world hasn't changed as much in recent times, and so there might still be some lessons for us to learn, the practical lessons from relatively recent history. If we move now on to epistemological issues from the pragmatic perspective, a strong theme within pragmatism is a healthy dose of skepticism. That is to say, a belief that human knowledge is fallible, that human knowledge is in many cases biased, that human knowledge is at best partial. And what this then implies for the study of history is that the more distant we are from the actual events back in the olden days, the more partial our knowledge is going to be, the more our biases from our contemporary perspective are going to limit us from being able to get inside the framework of an ancient time. And so as a result, historical knowledge is going to be seen as increasingly suspect. That is to say, pragmatists are less likely to think that we can achieve absolute knowledge or certain knowledge or even reliable knowledge about things the further back in history that they go. So historical knowledge or historical claims or historical narratives then from the pragmatic perspective tend to be treated much more skeptically than are treated by, say, the idealists and the realists, all of whom are more optimistic about our ability to acquire knowledge. Now, what this then implies rather for the study of history is that if we don't think historical knowledge is reliable, then we're not as likely to include it in our curriculum. We only want to have things that are reliable. If historical knowledge is suspect, then it becomes de-emphasized. Another thing that is characteristic of pragmatism, of course, is its value orientation. They will emphasize, this is partly an epistemological point, partly a value point, that we use knowledge for practical purposes. We're not as interested in truth for its own sake. But if it's also the case that human beings are biased and subjective, what is typically then going to be the case is that what we call historical knowledge is going to be something that comes down to us as constructed by people for their own sake, with their particular interests, with their particular biases, and so forth. And if our interests and our own biases in the modern world are different, then we're less likely to find the ancient history useful to us. It's often said, and pragmatists especially like this saying, that history is written by the winners. And so 300 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the people who were writing the history books or the history scrolls were likely to have been the winners, the victors, the ones who are more powerful. And so, of course, then we're just going to get a very biased and selective history. And so that is what gets handed down to us. That was history written with a particular set of axes to grind. We're dealing with very different axes right now. Chances are very good that what we're getting is not reliable and it's not going to suit our purposes now. So history becomes less valuable from the pragmatic perspective.